70 years ago, almost, Philip Sutton and I in Climate Code Red put down three basic propositions. The first was that the public understanding of the science of climate change was too conservative. The second was that the idea of limiting warming to 2 degrees was wrong, was far too high a target. We thought at 0.8 of a degree it was already probably too high, and what was safe was probably under half a degree of warming. And the third proposition was that the time was so short and the changes required so large that an emergency style, scale and speed and mode of action was now necessary. Recently, I returned to these questions of the policy making frame and the myths that seem to surround it at the moment, and wrote a short paper called Dangerous Climate Change, Myth and Reality, which will be available as you leave the space as well. And it's from that I've drawn tonight's talk. I'm not putting scientific references on the slides, but they are available in that document. This evening's event was first suggested by Mark Wakem of Environment Victoria as a way of bringing a wider audience to this discussion about myths and reality. So thanks for coming. So let's start. Ross Garnaut, in his report in 2011, wrote a chapter on scientific reticence in which he said climate science had a conservative systematic bias. And he went on, it's really well worth reading, his 2011 report. It was in what was called his Science Update. And there are many reasons for that. It's a very fast-changing discipline on the ground. It's a very recent discipline. There are large areas of things that science haven't looked at yet. The IPCC has a lag. It cuts off papers for its reports 3 years before the reports come out. And 3 years is a long time in climate change. There's a privileging of climate models over climate history in knowledge. And because models can't quantify certain things, things which you can't quantify are left out. So things like non-linear events. They have real trouble with the Arctic and the Antarctic and Greenland and sea ice because they don't model well. There are uncertainties, unknowns, and scientists talk about risks and uncertainties and probabilities, and people switch off. As soon as you say uncertainty, people stop believing you, basically. The scientists have been under attack, so they're more reticent to come out and not only say what they know in their research, but what they think, what we call an expert elucidation, their best expert summary thinking. James Hansen said, a few others do, but many won't. They stick to what I call black letter science, like black letter law, very conservative, this is the baseline and nothing more. The IPCC policy-making summaries are voted on by diplomats, not by scientists, and the boundaries between science and politics become blurred. So we have this field of which we call climate science, which I think actually exists in the space between science and politics. And this reticence gets multiplied in the media and in policy making. Inefficient attention is paid to the breadth and depth of science in the public sphere and in policy making. There's a tendency to prioritise what is politically convenient and push aside what's not convenient. So the IPCC reports, which the COP meetings are on, assume that there's no ice mass loss going to happen in Antarctica or the Arctic, and assume that there's going to be no permafrost change when they're already happening. I think the climate movement doesn't devote many resources to, and these are the important words, critically interrogating the science, as opposed to just accepting what you're told, and generally falls in, and the whole system at every level falls into a middle-of-the-road advocacy which ignores what Ross Garnaut called the bad possibilities, because everybody wants to stick together and say the same thing, rather than going out onto some space that some of us are more interesting to do. So we have a climate policy paradigm which has dominated us for the last 20 years, when science blurs with politics, and that paradigm is that climate change is not yet dangerous, that 2 degrees is a reasonable target and it's manageable because there's not going to be any really big significant impacts, particularly tipping points which are irreversible on human timescales in that time. There's a proposition we have a reasonable carbon budget left for 2 degrees, and this can all be done in an orderly, non-disruptive way. It's all win-win. Win for the climate, win for the economy. It's all easy. And by the way, we'll mitigate for 2, but in case we don't make it, we'll plan for 4, which sort of gives it away. So I just want to look at 7 of these myths. The first is that climate change is not yet dangerous. So in May, some scientists looking at Antarctica, said we can now show that at less than 1 degree of warming, the West Antarctic glaciers are in what they called unstoppable meltdown and 1 to 4 metres of sea level rise for the current temperature. And it will go up. For the current conditions, those glaciers are unstoppable. We know a lot of other tipping points have been passed. For the Arctic Ocean to be ice-free in summer within a decade or so, the rate of ice mass in Greenland is accelerating. It's actually on an exponential curve, the way that Jim Hansen said it would be 5 years ago. We've got extreme weather events around the world, heat, drought, cyclones. I mean, I think if you ask the people in New Jersey or the people who experienced Cyclone Haiyan or the people of Syria, where the climate change is already dangerous, or the people in the Pacific who are not going to be able to live on those islands anymore but it's already dangerous, they would say yes. And that's not just because of climate models, but because of climate history, what's called paleoclimatology, the study of past climates. We know that the last time greenhouse gases were the level they are today, about 400 parts per million, temperatures were 3 to 6 degrees warmer and sea levels were 25 to 40 metres higher for the current level of greenhouse gases. And if you look at, for example, at Syria, from 2006 to 11, Syria, the Fertile Crescent, the home of human civilization, where agriculture first started, had the worst drought in millennia. They think since the Fertile Crescent was first farmed. Total failure, 70%, 5% of people dependent on crop failures had total crop failures. People lost 85% of their livestock. 2 to 3 million people were put into poverty. And a report called The Arab Spring and Climate Change doesn't say that those conditions caused the war in Syria. There were other things, but it says that the unrest was a reaction to a brutal regime, but regional climate changes have played a role. That is, climate change became a force or impact multiplier in there. So when you look at Syria today, think that it is in part climate change. The second proposition, that paradigm, is that there's going to be no big tipping points before 2 degrees, but we know we have past one in the Antarctica. In Greenland, they now think the tipping point for Greenland is 1.5 degrees, under 2 degrees. Researchers, including Martin Mindshaus from the University of Melbourne, came out with research saying that if you got to 1.5 degrees of warming, you'd be down to less than 10% of the world's coral systems. They would be remnant systems. We've got researchers saying that about 1.5 degrees, they think the permafrost will start to lose carbon quite rapidly. And of course, there's multi-metre sea level rises. So there is now clear evidence that below 2 degrees, we will pass significant tipping points. So obviously 2 degrees, which sits in that policy-making frame between science and politics, is no longer the right target. For a start, it's 1 degree warmer than human civilization has ever experienced. So we are now on the edge of conducting an experiment for which we do not know the answer, and for which we have no prior knowledge. We will pass tipping points. Sea level rises will be in the tens of metres. Roughly, if you look at long historical periods, sea levels rise or fall about 15 metres for each 1 degree of change. 15 metres for each 1 degree of change over a few thousand years. And of course, many ecosystems and nations will be lost. And as Kevin Anderson from the Tyndall Centre says, 2 degrees, in fact, not the boundary to dangerous climate change, but the boundary between dangerous and very dangerous. So then we have the proposition, well, if we miss 2, let's go to 4. Human civilization would not survive it. Kevin Anderson says, and I quote, "A 4-degree future is incompatible with an organised global community." Now it's doing its own thing. Is likely to be beyond adaptation, is devastating the majority of ecosystems, and has a high probability of not being stable. And that's a scientist being understated about things. Okay, myth 5. The last IPCC report came out. The big headlines were, we have half carbon budget left. This is rubbish. Because if we think about it, we do not want to get 2 degrees, and you certainly don't want to get past it. Catastrophic events mean your risk management must have a really small chance or probability of exceeding the target. I mean, for aeroplanes, for bridges, it's 1 in a million, 1 in 10 million. It's that sort of thing. And in fact, the 2009 Copenhagen Accord made it clear that it was not a target, which you could see, but it was a cap. It talked about holding the increase to below 2 degrees. That was the Copenhagen Accord. Below 2 degrees means a very low probability of exceeding it. So, okay, one chart, sorry about this. So we can map the relationship between emissions up the left-hand side and the probability of not exceeding it along the bottom. And it's this blue curve from Mike Raupak at the ANU. So we can then put in this grey box, which is the amount of emissions we have already. And then for various probabilities, we can ask what budget we have left. So if we want a 33% chance of staying below 2 degrees, we put up a line, and we go across, and we've got this really big, healthy budget. And we go to 50%, and we've got a healthy budget. And that's what the headlines were. We've got half this budget left, but that's a 50% chance of failure. And then you can go to 66% chance. 2 in 3 chances are below 2 degrees, and you've got a smaller budget. But at that probability, the range is between 1 and 3 degrees. So if you have that red amount of emissions, you might actually get to 3 degrees rather than 2. So in fact, it could be a 3-degree target. And if you take a relatively low probability, only a 10% chance of not exceeding the carbon budget, there's something pretty obvious. There is no carbon budget left. Really, really important. Time has run out. Okay. The next thing they do is ignore what are called long-term feedbacks. In past climates, there have been things that happen quickly. You change greenhouse gases, you get more water vapour. These are called short-term feedbacks. There are longer feedbacks where polar ice mass disappears, where carbon sinks, for example, permafrost become mobilised, and they've been separated in time because the process has been slow. Now the rate of change in our energy system, the rate of change at which heat is coming in, is so quick that those two processes are being put together. For those of you who did electronics, you can have in series or in parallel. In series, one after the other, in parallel, where they're happening side by side. So short and long-term feedbacks are now happening in parallel rather than separated in time. And in fact, we have evidence that they're happening now. Last myth, and this almost comes back to Ross Garnaut. To have a 50% chance of 2 degrees, bad risk, bad target, we now need to reduce emissions in big emitting countries like us by 8 to 10% a year. And this is simply impossible within the policy frame that we have adopted. And it's mainly because Nicholas Sturman, in his report in 2006, said, we can do all this, but it can't be economically disruptive. And if we have emissions reductions of more than 2% a year, that will be disruptive, because it has been in the past. So let's keep it under 2% a year and everybody will be happy. And the whole international policy making frame has accepted this proposition that we can deal with climate change without it being economically disruptive. And that is now just muck. And it's now being accepted. The system now wants to shut down. It's almost like climate change has come too early. So climate policy making in its present form with that proposition cannot succeed. And I'm sure Paul will talk about this. Disruption is now necessary at a whole lot of levels. For all the unsustainable businesses, for the oil industry, disruption is necessary. For the air travel industry, disruption is now necessary. For our levels of consumption, disruption is now necessary. So, what do we make of all of this? Who's had a little look at Naomi Klein's new book? A few of us? I battled through it. Success is not possible within the current economic frame because it has no interest with the interests of the whole. Nowhere in the economic system is there any mechanism that says we will ensure that we don't use more than this amount of resources. Because free market economics is about little bits, what little bits do. And so the prevailing ideology we have of privatisation, deregulation, lower taxes, less government spending, free trade, globalisation, simply cannot solve the problem. It's actually the opposite of what we need. And what we need, and I'm sure Paul will talk about it, and we talked about it in Climate Code Red, is a very large-scale rescue plan. Naomi Klein, in her book, talks about a Marshall Plan for the Earth, or a Marshall Plan for the planet. You can call it war level of mobilisation, you can call it emergency, you can call it a rescue plan, you can call it a Marshall Plan. The words don't matter. I think what matters are the ideas. And the ideas are simply that there's a mode that this society goes into when things are really tough. And think about these words, first of all, in relationship to a fire or a flood. Events threaten to overwhelm. Failure is not really an option. You need evidence-based actions, things that will work, not ideology. The action is time sensitive and the delay makes it worse. You need rapid change, so you apply large resources quickly. Government plays a leading role. You don't put out a contract to merchant banks as to who'll put fire trucks at the bottom of the hill for the lowest price. You actually pay for them in advance and do it. In the case of war, you actually curtail consumption in order to invest in weapons, war bonds, that sort of thing. And during the war, and at other times of emergency, these things are supported because they're seen as fair and necessary. People accepted rationing in the World War II in Australia because they thought what was happening was fair and necessary. So our challenge, I think, is this. Last year, our movement didn't have the power to stop a climate denial government getting elected in Australia. I don't think there was a single National Liberal Party candidate or member who feared climate or environment as an issue when we went to the election. This is a terrible indictment of us. But I think the movement has been learning and has now learnt that success means more time engaging and mobilising people, as the CSG movement has shown, the coal movement, and building power, and less time lobbying and fetishising about policy detail. I remember Mark in June said, policy without power is just a good idea in your head, which I think really puts that debate in perspective. And I do think the work that Environment Victoria and FO and many others are doing in this state election, where hopefully a deniers government will be thrown out, is an opportunity, a turning point in terms of the community organising that is being done. So lastly, this idea that we now have to do something quite extraordinary, quite off the public agenda in some ways, I think is actually growing in recognition a bit. Ian Dunlop, who some of you will have met, who's standing for the BHP board again, is actually going around saying this is an emergency. And the UN Secretary General and Al Gore and all sorts of people have used this word. What I think we have to do is what Naomi Klein says in her book. We have to engage in the battle of ideas. We start winning when radical ideas become normalised. So what really needs to be done, I think, is an idea that we need to normalise. And just to finish rhetorically, she says, we are no longer waiting for politicians to declare disruption an emergency. We're going to declare it ourselves from below, just as movements always have. Thanks very much.